series in both Zoom and some of our audience who are watching the YouTube live stream. I'm Jayashree from the National Biodiversity Centre at the National Parks Board. We are currently into our second week of the Festival of Biodiversity. This is NParks' annual celebration of our natural heritage organized in collaboration with our Biodiversity Roundtable. This week, we have activities lined up all through the month of September, starting from 5th all the way to the 26th of September this month. We have got biodiversity talks, arts and crafts sessions that are available for download in our website, and something for everybody in your family. So please visit our website for more details on the Festival of Biodiversity. This month, we are also running a special edition of the NParks Spotlight series. It features our partners from the biodiversity community. We are online every weekend from 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. So be sure to join us both in Zoom or in the YouTube live stream. Today, we will learn about the Raffles Banded Langur, a strikingly beautiful black and white monkey, which has ivory bands running down the underside of the body and the limbs. It's a beautiful monkey, and I hope you will get to hear more about their behavior and the conservation efforts. Over the coming weeks, we will also be joined from friends from the National University of Singapore, the Otter Working Group, to know more about these respective species and the work that is being done for the conservation in Singapore. The program today would be, we will start with the talk by Dr. Andie Ang, and after that, we will also take in some questions and conclude the session. To make it easy for everyone, please send in your questions via the private message to me, and you can check in the drop-down list host Jayashree. And we will try to address as much as possible towards the end of the session. And now I have immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Andie Ang, who is a research scientist with the Wildlife Reserve Singapore Conservation Fund. And she is also the chairperson for the Raffles Banded Langur Working Group, which is a multi-partnership working group involving a lot of stakeholders. And she will be presenting her love for the langurs today. So over to you, Andie, and I hope you all have a great session today.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. So like Jayashree mentioned, I'll be sharing my love for langurs, and hopefully by the end of this session, you would also start to like the langurs a little bit more if you have not. I am a research scientist with the Wildlife Reserve Singapore Conservation Fund, and I've been researching on the langurs for a number of years now. Here is a slide on the non-human primates that we have in Singapore. So if we exclude humans, we have the Sunda solaris, the long-tailed macaque, and also the Raffles Banded Langurs. So a little bit more about the solaris. It is quite a small mammal that is active in the night. So usually by nighttime, it would be going around looking for food and mates. So in the daytime, it will be very, very difficult to see them. And it mainly feeds on tree gums, insects, and also fruits. They are also the only venomous primates in the world. For solaris, they are heavily threatened by the illegal wildlife trade because they're really, really cute. And so there are people who want to own this animal as a pet, but it's really dangerous because, like I mentioned, they are venomous, and it's also threatening their survival if you are owning them as a pet. And then we have the long-tailed macaques, which you would see more often in Singapore, in nature reserves, and also at the edge of the forest. They are active in the day, so when you go out to places where there are forests, you might have a chance to see them. And for the macaques, they are omnivorous, so they can eat a variety of plants and also little animals, such as the crabs or other insects. And then for the Raffles Banded Langurs, they are only found in Singapore and the southern parts of Malaysia. So in terms of distribution, it's really quite small and restricted. In Singapore, we have quite a small population of about 60 of them, whereas in Malaysia, we are talking about 200 to 250. So globally, this is a critically endangered species. And its diet is mainly vegetarian, so eating leaves, fruits, and flowers. What's so special about this langur is that even though it's mostly black in color, like you see in this photo, the babies are born white in color. So this photo here by Sabrina, you can see that this infant, it is white in color, but it does have a black stripe that goes from the back, so from the top of the head to the tail, and also across its shoulders. So it looks like a cross when you see it from the back. And if you had the chance to take a look at Wild City Forest Life, there is a rare footage of a newly born infant of the Raffles Banded Langurs. So around this time, it was maybe 1 to 2 weeks old, and the mom is really protective of the infants. So even though you can see quite a good, series of photographs of this infant, it actually is not very easy to see because they will be hiding among the foliage, and you really need like a large zoom camera in order to see the langurs. And they are also about maybe 18 to 20 meters above the ground. So when we observe langurs and other wildlife, it's also important to note that we need to keep our distance and also not to get too close because they can be easily disturbed. And in this case, for the langurs, they're very shy. So when you do spot the langurs, keep a distance and not to make too much noise so that you can also have a good experience looking at the wildlife. By about 9 months to 10 months, the white-colored infants would turn, the fur color would turn black, just like an adult. But at this time, they are still very close to the parent and would be carried around when they are traveling. So this video showed a 2-year-old juvenile, and usually juveniles are more curious than the adults. So for this juvenile, it actually got to the forest edge and was looking at us while it was feeding. But for us, we are keeping a distance of about 20 meters so that they don't feel threatened by our presence. And then we are just quietly taking photographs and videos and also observing what kind of activities they are doing. So in this case, they were eating on the leaves of angsana tree. What we do is also to follow the different groups of langurs in Singapore and to take photographs of their faces. And why do we do that? Because it's really important to identify each and every individual langur in different groups so that we can monitor their growth and also how the population is doing in Singapore. So in this particular case, it is the Snow White family. And at the beginning, all the langurs to us look the same. It's very difficult to distinguish the individuals. And so we started to name the individuals that we can recognize. For this family, it is actually Snowflake. Why the name? Because when we actually observe this individual, it is the youngest of the group and is white in color. So in a group of black langurs, when there's one white langur, that's easy to identify, right? So we name it Snowflake, and then of course the mom will be Snow White. And then as we go through the list, we slowly provide names for them once we're able to identify the individuals. And we also track their growth over time. And then this is another group of superheroes. We have a male, which is the alpha male of the group. And then you can see that for langurs, usually how the family is structured, it's such that you have one adult male and several adult females with their juveniles or infants. So in this case, this is a pretty big group of langurs with 1 male, 8 adult females, and its offspring. The langurs in Singapore, they are found in the Central Catchment Nature Reserve, but the surrounding forests are also very important for their survival, providing food resources, for example. And so NParks over the years have been restoring the habitats of those buffering areas and making them into nature parks in order to enhance the protection of endangered species like the langurs. So the latest addition is the Thompson Nature Park, which is also part of the critical habitat of the langurs in Singapore. Besides the nature park, there are also a number of things that NParks have been doing in the area. So for example, next to Thompson Nature Park, there used to be a 2-lane road, the Old Upper Thompson Road. But it is actually not very safe for people when they are jogging or walking in the area, or for animals when they're trying to get from one place to another. So what was done over the last 2 years was to convert 1 lane of the road into a park connector network so that people can use it safely and animals also get from one place to another safely. In addition, there are also efforts to identify areas where animals such as the langurs are using to cross from one place to another. So canopy road bridges are also constructed at certain hotspots so that it can facilitate, again, safe movement of arboreal animals like the primates. So this is just a footage that was provided by NParks when they were monitoring the usage of the road bridges. So you can see in this video, a langur was exploring the bridge and then it came across the camera. So for primates like the langurs and also like the macaques, they are highly curious and highly intelligent. So when they see something new, they would like to explore to see whether first, is it food? If it's not food, then they might not be interested and they might move on. So all these activities to monitor how they're doing are crucial information for our conservation efforts. And besides field observations, we also rely on other tools to help us gather more information about the langurs. And because langurs, they are arboreal, most of the time, on the trees, we have started to install cameras on the trees so that we can monitor langurs and other wildlife 24/7. Of course, you can't just climb trees. You have to be certified after going through training and getting the necessary permissions, identify the locations with NParks in order to identify strategic locations to install those cameras. And this is how it looks like. Once a month, we will be out there either to install new cameras or to check the cameras just to see, whether we have captured the wildlife or if the location is good or not. And it's really challenging because you can't just put a camera anywhere. You have to optimize the angle, the height, and so on, because sometimes you have leaves in front of the camera and it would trigger the camera to take photographs, and that's not what we want. For some of the trees which are by the roads, it's quite dangerous to climb manually. So we have to make use of lorry cranes, like in this case, to bring us up, and also maybe to higher spots on the trees to put cameras. So sometimes we are going up to about 18 to 20 meters, which is pretty high. And that's also about the height where the langurs will be using on the trees. So after a couple of months of trial and error, we managed to capture the langurs, which is really exciting for us because this helped us identify that this location is being used by the langurs. And we can then do further studies to look at how important this habitat is. Whether is it because providing food resources for the langurs or sleeping sites for the langurs. And there are times where we are able to identify all 3 species of, to capture all 3 species of non-human primates. In this case, you can see the slow loris, the long-tailed macaque, and the banded langur. So again, this information can also help authorities like NParks to identify locations which are of critical importance for primates. And besides the primates, we sometimes get other animals as well. In this case, some nocturnal animals. And on the top right, this animal is actually a colugo. Sometimes in the day, it might be very hard to see them because they are well camouflaged. And with cameras like this, it can also help us monitor other wildlife like the colugo. And then on the bottom right, we actually have a diffuse flying squirrel, which is also, again, very difficult to see. But with tools like the camera traps, it can help us monitor how they're doing in Singapore. But other times, we'll have images of animals that might be really difficult to identify at the beginning. And so we have to go through a lot of photographs and videos. And, over time, we would learn that some of these animals are like the long-tailed macaques, because macaques, they are highly curious by nature. And when they see new things in their environment, they will go in to investigate. So like the langurs, they might try to eat to see if it's food. For macaques, they'll also be really getting close to the lens to see what it is. So we get a lot of footages of macaques doing that. That's really cute. So another thing that we do in our research is to identify the food plant species that the langurs consume. Because if you know what foods they eat, we can then plant those tree species within their habitat. But of course, few observations are quite challenging because you have to find the langurs and then you have to see them consume some of the food plants and get a botanist to help identify the food. So what we do to complement our research is to look at poop. Well, some people might tell you poop is really not important, but in our case, poop is extremely important because it has a wealth of information. So besides the DNA of the animal, it also tells us how much parasites there are in the animal. And we also would learn more about the gut bacteria in the animal. In addition, we will also have the DNA of plants that the langurs have consumed. So if we're able to identify and extract and identify the plant species, it can help us to learn more about the variety of plants that the langurs are eating. Poop is so important that we actually produce posters for people to learn how to identify mammal poop. So you can see in these posters, besides the langur, we also have illustrated poop of loris, macaque, and also otters, civets, pangolins, leopard cats, bats, and so on. So, I wanted to emphasize that poop should be regularly collected during research, for researchers, of course, when we're doing scientific discovery, because we can learn more about the natural history of the animals and complement few observational work. So don't forget about poop. And another important thing that we are doing with multiple agencies is to recruit volunteers to train them to collect data on the langurs. Because one way for fellow Singaporeans, for people in Singapore to appreciate our wildlife is for them to go out there to look for wildlife and to learn more about the threats that are facing the animals and how we can all help. So the Citizen Science Program is one of the long-term programs that we have been doing since 2016. So it has been 4 years, where every 6 months we would recruit volunteers to train them on how to collect data, and they will go out during the weekends in our nature reserves, in the public trails, to look for langurs and collect data. So we have started recruiting, about last month, new volunteers to look for langurs, but we are restricting this only to our existing volunteers because of some of the restrictions due to the COVID pandemic. But we hope that next year we are able to open the Citizen Science Program to the general public again. So do look out for more information when we recruit volunteers. And you can go on to our Facebook page for Raffles Banded Langur Working Group to learn more about the activities that we do and also some of the updates on the langurs in Singapore and Malaysia. So I'd like to spend the remaining time to touch on the other species of primates in Singapore, the long-tailed macaques. The macaques are probably the primate species that we see more often compared to the other two species. But the macaques, they are highly misunderstood. And during our research, we have come across some issues when people face interacting with these animals. So hopefully through this presentation, you can learn more about the macaques and how to coexist with this species. So in the news, whether it's in Singapore, in Malaysia or elsewhere, sometimes you would come across articles like this, where it's mostly negative. Monkeys snatching food, monkeys being aggressive, and some ways to control the population of monkeys. So like in Singapore, some of these articles you might have come across where you have monkeys entering people's houses, going to bins to get food, harassing people and things like that. But the thing is, most of the time, I would say more than 95% of the time, the macaques are just minding their own business, within the forest, getting food from their natural sources or playing with each other. But this kind of news will never show up, in media or in social media, because what's so interesting about a monkey playing with another monkey? And usually when it turned up, in the newspapers, it's usually things that happen. For example, monkey entering people's houses. So we shouldn't be thinking that this happened, most of the time, or it's actually usual for monkeys. And there's actually a lot of reasons for why things like this happen. Sometimes we might not be conscious that, if we don't secure the bins properly, animals like the monkeys would have easier access to those food trash. And so, we are providing indirect feeding to animals like the monkeys. Or sometimes along forest edges, we notice that people would leave some of those food behind, thinking that, we do not want to waste food. So perhaps we'll just leave those food behind for the animals to eat. And this is really, really bad because it will attract the animals out from the forest onto the roads. And when they're feeding, they might be knocked down by cars when they are driving by. Or sometimes even in more extreme cases, we have people driving to near nature reserves to actively feed the animals, thinking that, oh no, it's just a piece of bread, it's just one time, doesn't really matter. But actually over time, you actually attract animals out and also make the animals see humans as sources of food. And this is not what we want to do. They have enough food in the forest. So some of the things that we have been doing, at least for the Jane Goodall Institute in Singapore, is to train volunteers, residents to become monkey guards. So this is a sustainable and humane way of trying to resolve issues when it comes to wildlife. So the residents and volunteers, they are trained to deter monkeys away from residential area and slowly guide them back into the forest. But of course, this has to be done together with educational efforts. So we have to remove any potential sources of food, whether is it in the trash bin or is it lying around, for the animals to see. So we also talk to the residents on certain behavior that we can do to improve this relationship with our wildlife. We also bring people out to nature reserves to observe macaques and also other animals, just to see, what their natural behavior is, and they are not interacting with people if we are actually able to also behave appropriately in front of wildlife. Together with various agencies like NParks in the long-tailed macaque working group, there is also a no-feeding campaign that was launched last year by Minister Desmond Lee when Dr. Jane Goodall was in Singapore. So this campaign is going to be over about 3 to 4 years, mainly to raise awareness about the negative consequences when you feed animals like macaques and why we shouldn't be feeding animals. This is also in line with the new Wildlife Act that was in place in Singapore since June this year, where feeding of wildlife anywhere in Singapore can incur a maximum fine of $10,000. So, we just have to be really careful and conscious about our behavior and activities, especially in Singapore where we are surrounded by nature. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I would like to thank all my partners in universities and also in different funding agencies for the work that I'm doing. Thank you so much. So back to you, JSG.
Thank you so much, Andie, for giving a very comprehensive overview of our langurs as well as the long-tail macaques in Singapore. And thanks to our participants in Zoom for sending in the questions. I know many of you wanted to learn a little bit more about the langurs and our native primates. So I will shortlist some of the questions for Dr. Andie Ang to answer now. One of the first questions we had was for members of public especially, what are some tips to spot the Raffles Banded Langur? Because you seem to mention they live high up on the trees and they can be shy and elusive. So for a beginner, how can we go out and spot these animals?
So for a start, I mentioned that they are found in Central Catchment Nature Reserve. And one of the places that you have a good chance of seeing a langus would be the Thompson Nature Park. And when you're there, you have to be quite quiet, so don't make too much noise, and to look up on the trees. So sometimes your neck would be, sore at the end of the day. That's what happened to us. But look out for movements on the trees and also some of the crashing sounds when the animals are moving. Because for langurs, they are quite big in body size. And so when they move from tree to tree, it creates quite, a loud noise. So look out, hear the crashing sounds and also look out for movements, but be sure to be quiet so that you can increase your chances of seeing the langurs because they're quite shy and they're disturbed by noise.
Thanks, Andie. So I think that is for a start to sort of use a mix of all our senses. Yeah, so we need to be alert visually to spot like a striking black monkey just running up the canopy, and also keep our ears open to hear some unusual sounds of things crashing in the canopy. And and Andie would be glad to hear any of those sightings if some of our participants come across the langurs in Thompson Nature Park or in Central Catchment Nature Reserve. Over to the next question. Okay, so this, I think many people had some curiosity, especially when you showed the family tree. How can you tell the difference between all the individual langurs that you showed us pictures of?
It's really challenging because, again, at the beginning, they all look the same. But over time, we make use of the photographs that we take. So whenever we have the opportunity, we will take a lot of high quality photographs of their faces. And from there, we'll identify some of the characteristics because some of the langurs might have scars or some coloration, some spots, or just, how they look for, the hair because they have a mohawk, but it varies between the individuals. So over time, we can see which characteristics are more permanent so that we can use that to identify. And other times, we make use of the demographics of the group. So what I mean is that, there are different groups of langurs in Singapore, and maybe one group will have 10 langurs. The other group will have 5 langurs. And perhaps they're separated by a road or, the forest might not be connected. And so in this case, we know that they are separate groups. And then once you know they're separate groups, and within maybe the group of 10, there are 3 adults or 5 juveniles, 2 babies, things like that. So you know that based on these demographics and the composition, the different individuals. Then you'll use that to complement the photographs that we take. So then we're able to identify and then name them.
Okay, so that's great. So you give us maybe a beginner's version and like an advanced version in telling the langurs apart, which is for a start to look out for facial features, make those high quality photos. And for somebody who watches them regularly, maybe to start taking note of the demographics and the structure within the group. So the more they observe, then they start understanding how many adults and juveniles there are in the group. I think there were two associated questions when you had earlier spoken about how to spot the langurs. A participant asked if it is good to go in the day or in the evening, and if these langurs are present in our offshore islands. Maybe you could address that before we take the next question. Yeah.
Yes, good questions. So they're only found on the main island of Singapore and only found within the Central Catchment Nature Reserve. What I mean is, for example, they are no longer found in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, but with the eco-link, there are hopes that, you know, they can recolonize Bukit Timah Nature Reserve because they used to be found in Bukit Timah Nature Reserve. Yeah, so not on our offshore islands. What was the previous question?
Which is a good time of the day to see them? Should we go during the day or in the evening?
So for the langurs, they wake up really early when the sky gets a little bit bright. So by about 7 a.m., they'll be quite active, moving out from their sleeping locations to look for food. And they'll be active from probably about 7 a.m. to maybe noon, because that's when it's going to be really hot. So a bit like humans, when it gets noontime, we get a little bit tired. We don't really want to move. So for the langurs, it's the same thing. From about noon to maybe 2 p.m., they will be resting, not moving too much, taking a nap. So the chances of seeing them might be lower because if they're not moving, they're well camouflaged. So even though they're black in color, it's actually well camouflaged when they're, you know, among the foliage. So the chances of seeing them are pretty low. And then by about late afternoon, I would say maybe 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., this is a good time to spot the langurs because they will be active again to look for food to eat before they go back to sleep. So when it gets dark, they'll also go to bed. Yeah, so they'll be active right about after they wake up and just before they go to bed. So early morning, late afternoon.
Okay, that's great, and it's good for starters. It seems like both morning person and not so morning person will have good chances.
They have a chance to see. Yes.
To see the langurs. Yeah, thank you so much for those tips. Okay, so this is an interesting question. A few of them actually asked this. Do the langurs interact with the long-tailed macaques or other species of primates? This one is curious because you did mention about non-human primates, and you could share a little bit more about the interactions between the primate species we have here.
So the macaques and langurs, they are found within the same area in Central Catchment Nature Reserve. But they utilize the habitat quite differently. So for the langurs, they are mostly, you know, on the trees, so quite high up. I'm talking about maybe 10 meters to 20 meters. For the macaques, they are also found on the trees, but at a lower height. And sometimes they can also be seen on the ground. So in terms of tree heights, they're already using different parts of the forest. But when they do come into contact with each other, most of the times that we see, they are quite okay with each other's presence. So in a way, they are leaving each other alone. They will be doing their own business, eating the food or, you know, traveling. So there's not much interactions, but there are other times where we do see them competing for the same food resource. And for the langurs and macaques in Singapore, macaques usually have a bigger group size. So we're talking about maybe sometimes 20, sometimes even up to 30 individuals. Whereas for the langurs, they are smaller in group size, talking about 5 to maybe 10. So just in terms of numbers, they are outnumbered. So in this case, and also because langurs are usually more shy and timid, so when there's competition, they will usually move away, and macaques would be eating the food. And after macaques leave, the langurs will come back. So it's kind of like taking turns. They don't really fight too much. So I think it's a good way, example of coexistence between these two primates.
Thanks for that, Andie. It is quite interesting to hear that they do have varied types of interactions, sometimes being very accommodating to each other and sometimes competing with each other for resources. And it's also heartening to know how they coexist within our forests. And again, for some of our viewers asking how you can spot these individuals, these langurs, maybe you can also keep a lookout for the long-tailed macaques during your trips and hopefully observe some interesting interactions between the two species in some of those areas in Central Catchment and Thompson Nature Park. Okay.
So maybe just to add on, in terms of body size, the langurs are double the size of macaques. So that's the difference when you are trying to observe animals like the primates.
Okay, so there we have another tip to also look out for the relative sizes, and one is definitely bigger, and that's good tip on spotting these individuals. Okay, we will now move on to the next question. Okay, so this seems to be specific about the no feeding campaign that you mentioned. Could you give some updates on how the campaign has been going, and if volunteers or the members of public can take part in these initiatives?
So it was launched end of last year, and the focus has been on gathering existing data on where the macaques are so that we can identify the hotspots where they occur and where the conflicts might happen. So that over time, when we collect data and through our campaign, we can try to reduce those hotspots where there are conflicts and also to raise more awareness about coexistence. So the focus has been really collecting existing data and also recruiting volunteers to help to go out to the field to collect data. But we all know when COVID happened, we can't do all these things. So it was actually on hold for a couple of months. And only about maybe last month, 2 months ago, we started to recruit volunteers again and train them on things to look out for, the kind of data to collect. So we are still waiting for the restrictions to ease a little bit more so that we can have our volunteers to go out to the field to collect this information when it's safer. But overall, now, what we have been trying to do is also to generate some publicity, whether is it to infographics or social media content, so that we can actually share more information about the need to not feed monkeys. So yeah, in the couple of months ahead, we are looking to recruit more volunteers, citizen scientists, to help to collect data and share more about the no feeding campaign. So do look out on the websites.
Oh, thanks for that, Andie Ang. And yeah, it's great to know that there is an initiative and a start to convince people that there is no need to feed. And of course, for a start, we could all spread that information. So for the viewers who are listening to this talk now, please share with your friends and family to not feed the wildlife. And of course, it is in line with the legislations that were updated in June. And if you see such feeding happening, you can always report to the authorities using the hotline. Before we end the session, I have more questions coming in specifically on tips to sea langurs, something about their behavior. So we'll take in a few more questions. I don't want to, leave some of them out. So An interesting question is, where do these langurs sleep? Are they sleeping on the trees, or somebody's curious about that?
Yeah, so they sleep on the trees, usually about 10 meters or 12 meters above the ground. And they usually would prefer bigger trees. So trees with larger trunks and branches. For the langurs, they usually sleep either kind of like face down. So imagine the four limbs of the langurs hugging the branch. So they're lying down sleeping, or they're hugging the trunk to sleep. And sometimes individual langurs will be huddling each other, to keep warmth and to sleep. So you would see like a clump of black figure, at the bifurcation of the trunk and the branch, or, at the ends of the, on the branches. So bigger trees.
Okay, that's a very interesting observation, and it kind of paints a very, very nice picture to imagine as you're narrating how they sleep on the trees. And I hope
very relaxed. Sometimes when we do the tree climbing to put the cameras, maybe about 15, 16 meters above the ground, I'm trying to imagine how can a langur sleep at this height. It's quite terrifying, and especially when they're moving from tree to tree, I can't imagine. It's just, wow, the leap of faith.
Oh, yes. And of course, they are well adapted to living in those arboreal areas up on the trees. So I feel they are truly at home up there. Yeah.
Which is why it's also important, when we do conservation, to protect all those, trees within the habitat, and also restoring their habitat with the plant species.
Okay. That is very, very interesting to know how some of these behavior that we don't normally see, but then we have to rely on researchers like you who make such keen observations in the field. Okay, so let's move on to the last question, which links to what you had mentioned. What is your one key takeaway in your conservation journey?
From my experience, and also, during this journey, doing conservation, I think what's really important is the collaboration between different stakeholders. So for a conservation project to be successful, it doesn't depend on a single individual or single agency or organization. It's a collective effort from various people, whether it's the experts in the field, authorities, or non-governmental organizations, because different people bring in different perspectives and experience to this conservation, whether is it to one animal, to the habitat, or the ecosystem. So I believe that in order for conservation to be successful, you need to have the collaboration from various people. You cannot do it alone. And so I think that's, for me, the one takeaway is to work with different people and to gather information collectively and work things out together.
Okay, that's very perspective, I must say. And thank you so much, Andie, for taking all these audience questions and inspiring us to play our part in the conservation of our biodiversity as well. And just like what Andie mentioned, we can all play our part, and community engagement is definitely a key to realizing our mission of transforming Singapore into a city in nature. And it is also one of our thrusts in the Nature Conservation Master Plan, which is a systematic approach to conserving our biodiversity. For more information, do check out the links that are being shared in your group chat. And you can also watch the very first NParks Spotlight series, where our group director of National Biodiversity Centre, Mr. Lim Liang Jim, shared about this master plan in his talk. On our YouTube channel, you can also catch up on the past sessions of the NParks Spotlight series. If you enjoyed the talk today about langurs, there is a lot more to learn about our Singapore's biodiversity. And if you liked what you saw today and want to know more, Tomorrow, we are having another spotlight series on bees. We have Assistant Professor John Asher and Mr. Zestin So, who will be sharing about wild bees as a watchable wildlife in Singapore. They are the authors of our very first guidebook on bees, and they will share their experiences and some of the behind the scene experience on developing this particular guidebook. The registration link for the talk will be shared in your chat group. And also don't forget that we have a lot of activities relating to biodiversity planned for this month. Do check out our website on the Festival of Biodiversity and download the activities that your families can take part in as well. Finally, if you're inspired by what you heard today and want to support our local biodiversity, we hope you will consider making a donation to NParks registered charity and IPC Garden City Fund. 100% of your contributions will go into species recovery projects, for example, birds and butterflies, just to name a few, and other conservation projects, outreach programs, education that will support our flora and fauna. You can make a donation at the link that will be shared in your chat group soon, or you can follow the link that is being displayed in your screen right now. We would like to hear from you on what you thought about the session today and your feedback and comments on the series as a whole. This brings us to the end of the session. I would like to thank Dr. Andie Ang for sharing her knowledge with us and patiently taking all the questions from our audience. And we would also like to thank our audience, both in Zoom and our YouTube live stream platform, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the session today. Do spread the word around. It's always good to have more people listening and knowing about our local biodiversity. I hope you had a good time today, and we will see you pretty soon in one of our programs. And until then, have a great weekend ahead. Stay safe. And thank you very much. Good day, everyone.